In our last program, we started a definition of language. In this particular definition, we were going to try to show exactly what language was. You may remember that we said language was an arbitrary system of vocal symbols, an arbitrary system of vocal symbols. And we said that that term system was the most important term in our definition, because this term actually summed up the amazing patterns that all languages were, and that these were systems of symbols, and that these symbols actually stood for things in the world of experience. And the way in which they related to the world of experience was arbitrary. There wasn't any necessary connection in the world of reality between the thing symbolized and the symbol. And we also noticed that in the case of all symbol systems, people confused the symbol with the thing it stands for, and that this was most amazingly noticed in the confusion between language and writing. Writing being a symbolization of language, and yet people actually thinking of writing as language, and failing to realize that writing was a symbolization of language, which in turn was a symbolization of experience. Now we're going to continue with our definition, and I want to add these terms. I want to say language is an arbitrary system of vocal symbols through which human beings interact. Human beings, of course, is in our definition. It's extremely important because, as we found out on our first program, only man can talk. No form of animal life has this amazing arbitrary system of vocal symbols which we call language. So human beings interact. Now, interact becomes extremely important because this refers to the fact that we have to have human societies as already going concerns, or else the individual human being born so helpless as he is, with the longest period of helplessness, he would actually perish if he weren't able to be taken care of by people who knew how to take care of him, who had a division of labor, said this is your job in relation to the kid, this is your job, and so on. In other words, human societies are absolutely essential to human life, and the whole business that makes human societies possible, so human beings can interact, is this amazing business of language. Now, human beings not only have to interact in human societies, but actually they have to learn to become human beings. You may be born an American, but you have to learn to become an American. You may be born a Chinese, but you have to learn to become a Chinese. In other words, human beings have to learn to become human beings through their interaction with other people in human societies. This is extremely important. Now I'm going to add another term, or another set of terms to our definition. Language is an arbitrary system of vocal symbols through which human beings interact in terms of their total culture. In terms of their total culture. In other words, this term culture now becomes the term that I want to talk about. What does culture mean in this connection? Well, I'll tell you. Culture actually here refers to the whole way of life of a people. Everything a group of people does in order to answer the universal problems of human existence. In other words, mankind, wherever we find it, has the same kind of problems to face. We've all got to eat, we've all got to sleep, we all have to be able to keep out of the weather, not too cold, not too hot, all of these things. These are universal problems of human existence. Now, each human society, so to speak, has actually invented a set of systematized answers to these universal problems of human existence. A set of systematized answers to the universal problems. This set of systematized, interrelated answers we call a human culture. It's everything in the way of life, as I've said. Attitudes, values, assumptions, the product of man's hand, the product of man's brain, everything he passes down from generation to generation. The total business. Now, language is part of this totality. Language is a system of the total culture, but a unique system. Because language is that system through which all of the other systems of a total culture are reflected and transmitted. In other words, we, in our learning to become human beings, we have to learn our language as we learn the rest of our culture. Because most of our learning, or a great deal of our learning, actually goes on, is mediated through language. But language is culture, and culture is language. In other words, it forms a sort of seamless web. In other words, you can't separate language from culture in the world of reality. Of course, we linguistic scientists or linguistic analysts do. We try to pull it apart artificially so we can see how this system of language structures. But when the child is learning to become a human being in his society, in his culture, he doesn't say, now I'm going to learn the language, now I'm going to go over and learn the culture, now I'm going to learn the language, No. He actually is learning his language as he's learning his culture, as he's learning his culture, he's learning his language, because this is a seamless web. It cannot really be separated. In this regard, then, we might say that language is culture, again, in culture is language. Well, if language and culture are so interrelated, we would not be surprised then to find that things that are important in the culture are going to be found reflected in the language. And if we find something in the language, we're going to expect to find that important in the culture. And of course, this is obviously true. If we take, for instance, such obvious things as vocabulary words, vocabulary items, the words that we use, we would expect people who are concerned about various kinds of things to have words for those kinds of things that they're concerned about. And we're obviously not wrong. As an example of this, there are a group of Indians who live in the Altiplano, the high region of the Andes in Bolivia. These Indians are called the Aymara. And the Aymara Indians have a saying in their language which goes as follows: potatoes are money. Now, you know, in our language we say time is money, but the Aymara say potatoes are money. And Weston Labar, the anthropologist, has studied the potato vocabulary and classification system of the Aymara and finds that they have no fewer than 209 separate terms for potatoes. 209 varieties of potatoes, each with a separate term. Now, that's a lot of potatoes. This will give you an example of how this thing works. Here are only 18 selected from this 209. The first one here is tanta. Now, this one is an old potato. Very thin, black skin over white flesh. The second one here in order, picked at random, is the kunturi or condor potato, with a black skin with white veins, watery white inside, and very resistant to frost. This one here, the koyu, is a purple potato with a white skin, speckled with reddish spots, purple flesh, and shallow round eyes. It resists frost very poorly, but keeps up to 8 months and grows over 10,000 feet in rich soils. 209 separate terms. Do you think that this is silly to have all of these words for all of these varieties of potatoes? Who cares about that? Are these people peculiar? No. When you compare them or contrast them to ourselves in this regard, you will find that it's not so strange. When you look, for instance, at this, here are just a few of the kinds of nails and such like implements that we have. Please notice these things all fulfill the same function. But this one we call a fence staple, and this one we call a railroad spike. That's a flooring spike. This one is a hinge nail. This one is a wire brad. Notice these different words, yet they're all nails. In other words, we are concerned with nails, if you will, and the Aymara is concerned with potatoes. What a culture finds important, it is going to name. And if you find a lot of vocabulary items, you've got a pretty good indication of what the people think is important. Now, at the beginning of the program, I said that we were, or at least I raised a question, and that question was, do primitive people have primitive languages? Now, of course, to answer this question, we have to ask one other question. Who's primitive? Because what we find out is this. Every group, every society thinks the other fella is not as highly developed as he is. In other words, this is what we call ethnocentrism. That's the technical term for it. Ethnocentrism means that every well-adjusted adult in every culture, in every society, is convinced that the answers to the universal problems of human existence that his group has developed, these are obviously the best answers to the universal problems of human existence. Actually, what he says in some cases, what actually goes on is that they think nobody else is even human. In other words, that the answers they have are the only human answers. This is ethnocentrism, and this is actually universal. Now, in our own particular case, what's our scale of ethnocentrism? I really think, without being facetious, that we hold a rule of thumb upon the world like this. We say if they've got inside plumbing that works, they're civilized. If they haven't, they're underdeveloped. Well, I can promise you that other people on the face of the earth are not so concerned about television cameras, elevators, escalators, nails, and so on as we are. In other words, we've gone in for technology. We think gadgetry and technology is extremely important. And of course it is. But other people think religio-philosophical systems are more important and think our interest in gadgets is maybe good, all right, for a 12-year-old boy, but not for an adult. Each group has its own standards. And in this regard, since each group has its own standards, and each group finds different things important to talk about, every language does just about as well or just about as badly in actually referring to this. It's awful hard for us to realize this, though. We really still believe the other fellow's language must be less developed than ours because his way of life is not as developed as ours, and so it goes. I can remember in the last war, I was, at that time, a first lieutenant. A colonel made a report in my presence, and the colonel had been set up by the adjutant general to find out how we were going to draft Navajo Indians into the Army. And he was making a report with my colonel right there, before he reported to the adjutant general. And my colonel said, "Now, Colonel, how are we going to draft the Navajos in the Army?" This colonel, mind you, had been on this mission, had a degree from a leading Eastern university. And this is what he said: "We're not going to draft the Navajo Indians into the Army because the Navajos have no language." Well, I was a little bit surprised. I said, "Colonel, sir, do you mean you were in a part of the reservation where the Navajos had not yet learned to write their language, knowing this confusion between language and writing?" He looked at me as only a lieutenant colonel can look at a first lieutenant, and he said, "Lieutenant, I am not so naive as that. I mean, they have no language." Well, at this point, I was really concerned. I said, "What do you think they got, for heaven's sake?" And he said, "Oh, I don't know. I suppose 350 grunts." I give you my word, those were his exact words. Now, in comparison to English, is Navajo only 350 grunts? You may remember last time I was talking about English, and I said in that sentence that I did, I dropped the chalk. I said to say a sentence like I dropped it, we had to refer to various things. We couldn't get out of it. And you may remember how the English went. I dropped it. English specifies the subject I, the type of action dropped, and the time of action past. Essential for those three. But now let's look to do. Navajo has to specify the subject, the direction of the action, downward, na. Has to find out whether this is a definite or indefinite object, has to be specified. Whether the object is a round, bulky object or one of 7 other classifications in the world of experience. Net. And not only that, that's not all they have to do. They have to go on and they have to talk about the amount of control the subject has over the process. In the act of letting it fall has to be shown, lake, from the region of the hand. The whole business, nashne, lake. I was in the act of letting the definite, bulky, roundish, hard object fall from the region of my hand. In other words, this isn't just what they can say. This is actually what they have to say every time they say this simple thing, like I dropped it. Now, the Navajo also have those motion verbs. And we talked about the motion verbs. And you may remember that the Navajo couldn't just simply say that he was going to go somewhere. He had to say how he was going to go, by what means of locomotion. Now, there are 6 different motion verbs. 6 different motion verbs. Notice, it's different if you go on foot, if you go on horseback, if you go on a trot, if you go on a gallop, if you go by air, and so on. Again, the Navajo is not interested, particularly, as to whether or not there is time, but he is interested, or tense, as we say, but he's interested in the aspect of an action. Now, here is how the Navajo is going to have to talk about the simple thing of kicking somebody. We are concerned in English about the time of the kicking. He, the aspect of kicking. I kicked him. The second thing there, I gave him a kick on repeated occasions. I gave him repeated kicks on the same occasion. I gave him repeated kicks on repeated occasions. They're interested in the kind of kicking. We're interested in the time. Obviously, this is hardly what we would call a very primitive language consisting only of grunts. Now, is one language, we talk about primitiveness, is one language older than another? All I can say is this: we know very little about the origin of language, but we do know this. Ever since man was man, he talked. And when he was able to talk, and only when he was able to talk, was he able to make implements. To make a stone implement to meet an imagined exigency or exigency of the future, this thing requires conceptual thinking, and that can only be done through language. In other words, every language now spoken on the face of the earth has an equal amount of history behind it, because our species has to be assumed to have an equal amount of history behind it. Now let's take the complicated business of making a stone implement. To make a stone implement requires skill and dexterity. Here on our board we have 2 stone implements. The first one is shown both frontways and sideways, and the second one only frontways. It is inconceivably complicated, a technique to be able to actually do that kind of operation, to be able to flake carefully along the side and differently on the face of this business. To look at these things, you might think that they were made by the same man 2 days before, but actually they were not. These particular things were made probably 1,000 years apart, and one was discovered in France and the other was discovered in Palestine. In other words, this particular technique and how it was done could only have been carried on through the communicative process of language. Languages are as old as humanity, and every language has an equal amount of history behind it. Now, here's another problem. Is one language better? Well, we've already seen that our Aymara Indians were concerned with potatoes. Potatoes were unknown in our languages until the Spaniard actually found the American Indians growing potatoes. We borrowed the potato in only one of those 209. Not all of them, but just one. We borrowed the potato from the South American Indians, and we borrowed the word from that language. In other words, as soon as we got the potato, we had a way of talking about it. We borrowed the word. In this way, this is important. Every single language will always have a way to talk about anything that comes into that culture. So when we got the potato, we found a way to talk about it. When the Moroccan Arab, for instance, got the railroad train, he borrowed the word from French and Spanish speakers. He calls the railroad engine el tren or el chemin de fer. When the Chinese got the railroad train, they called it huacha, which means fire cart. They dipped into their word supply in order to talk about it. In other words, huacha is just as good a way of talking about a diesel-electric locomotive as diesel-electric locomotive is. If you have to talk about something, you'll have a way in your language to talk about it. Now, it still is very hard for us to realize that one language is not better than another when I keep saying that languages are perfectly okay. Everyone does the job just about as well or just about as badly. In the last century in Europe, there raged a great debate as to whether or not the Australian Aborigines were members of Homo sapiens. Were they members of the human race or not? Well, you know, after all, everything in Australia was found to be old-fashioned, to be out of date. So what more obvious than suppose the human beings that were found there were maybe an earlier form of man, like Homo neanderthalensis, Neanderthal man. Well, anyhow, they went in and they measured and they poked and they prodded and they wrote each other learned journal articles, and finally all the evidence was in, and yes, lo and behold, it was decided the Australian Bushmen, the Australian Aborigines, were members of Homo sapiens. They were members of the human race. Well, lots of Westerners then who had been concerned about this whole business then went in rather large numbers. Among these, of course, were missionaries. And the missionaries, who were speakers of North European languages, all were shocked to a man to have the Australians ask them the same question when they learned enough of the Australian language or vice versa for communication to take place. This is what the Australians asked them. How do you people get along with such a miserably developed language? Can you imagine the shock? Can you imagine the surprise a good ethnocentric missionary would get being asked a question like that by a man who'd just been admitted to the human race? It was almost more than they could bear. Now, why did they ask this question? Well, it's very simple. These Australians are very much concerned with kinship. Everything an Australian is or does or hopes to be in his whole behavior is actually governed by his relationship to other people. Because he is interested in kinship, he obviously has words for kinship relationships. Take a look at this. Fathers, mothers, these terms here, pala and aranga, father's father and father's mother. These look all right, sure. Now here's an interesting one, however. Fathers, mothers, brother's son, antara. This we would have to translate first cousin once removed, a generation back on your father's side. In other words, we can say father's, mother's, brother's son, or first cousin once removed, blah, 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 but they have one term to cover this whole business. Now let's look at some more here. Mother's, brother's, son's daughter. Another term, namara. Father's father's sister. Mother's mother. Obviously, these are relatively good terms. Simple terms to us. But look at this one now. Maternal grandmother's brother's son's daughter. Ebmana. That would mean a female second cousin on your mother's side. Actually, there are plenty of these terms. There are 41 kinship relationships and 21 terms to talk about them. Obviously, if you want to go in for kinship, the Arunta language is a beautiful language to use. And you can see why they thought that our language, with a term like cousin, for instance, doesn't even tell what sex it is, let alone what side of the family and what the relationship is. You can see how they thought that these missionaries had miserably developed languages because they didn't have words for the things that are obviously the most important things in the world. Every language is as precise or as imprecise as it needs to be in order to handle a culture. Every language does as good a job as every other language does. This Arunta language is the best language in the world for the Arunta. The Aymara language is the best language in the world for the Aymara. And American English is the best language in the world for Americans. Now, at the beginning of the program, I said that language is learned, that we must learn to become human beings. And right now, then, I want to add our final term. to our definitions. I want to say language is a learned arbitrary system of vocal symbols through which human beings interact in terms of their total culture. Language is a learned arbitrary system. Now, this term immediately raises a question. Is one language harder than another? We've asked many questions now about language. Is one language harder than another? In absolute terms, does one language present more of a problem for Homo sapiens to learn as a problem than another language? All I can say in this connection is this. Although we are not sure, and we know really very little about how children learn languages, this seems to be the case. If you're physiologically normal, the child is physiologically normal. The child is physiologically normal. He is on to the structure of his language, to the system of his language, by the time he's 5.5 years old, give or take a month or so. 5.5 to 6, anyhow. In other words, we would assume that if one language was absolutely harder than another language, that the children wouldn't be on to it until maybe well over 6. And if a language was easier absolutely, that they might be on to it at 4 years or less than 4 years old. Who knows? But here's the facts, however, seem not to bear this out. All languages seem to be learned in terms of the system at about the same time by physiologically normal human beings. Now, of course, you've all heard, just as I've heard, that one language is obviously harder than another. In fact, I remember how it was told to me. Everybody knows the 3 hardest languages in the world are Japanese, Chinese, and Russian. Now, the person that told me that had never had 1 minute's acquaintance with any of those 3 languages. But I nodded my head wisely, and I passed it on to the next sucker because we never really care to examine these kinds of statements. They all seem so obvious. Reason, of course, for that is because of the writing system confusion. You see, the writing system looks funny, so obviously the language is hard because you're confusing language with writing. But I can promise you, you go to Japan and you'll find that the children of 5.5 are speaking Japanese. You know, it reminds you of that story of Mark Twain. He was said to be so surprised to get to Paris and find that even the children spoke French. Well, children do speak all languages. In other words, there is no language, as far as we can gather, that is absolutely harder than any other. They are relatively harder. In other words, Navajo, the language we were examining a little while ago. Navajo is an extremely difficult language for Americans to learn, because the structure of Navajo and the structure of English or any Western European language are vastly different. But Apache, which is a language which structures very similarly to Navajo, the Apache speaker doesn't find Navajo anywhere near as hard to learn. It reminds me also of a story, this about difficult languages. I can remember I was at a UN conference one time, and there was a Japanese translator who was there, and he was trying to drum up interest by these good people in the UN to see if they couldn't raise the fee for Japanese translators translating European books. And he would give his little spiel at each room, and I can remember one dear lady asked him, she said, may I ask you a question, Mr. Yamamoto? Which language do you find harder to translate from, English or German or Russian? And he looked at it and he said, all the same. And so would Esperanto have presented him just about the same problem. In other words, Japanese structures so differently from any European language that any manufactured European language like Esperanto is going to be just as hard or just as easy. It's a toss-up. We, from inside the Western European languages, think, of course, of Esperanto as being duck soup. Or maybe we think that Spanish is an easier language than German. If we've been told this, we'll believe it. But to a speaker of a non-European or non-Indo-European language, obviously these languages are about of the same measure of difficulty. They find them all the same. So no one is absolutely harder. There's another thing about this. As I say, we don't know really very much about how children learn language or when they do. But our observations to date seem to indicate that the child at 3.5 is pretty well in control of the patterns of his language. I remember I tried to test this out one time, and I came back from the office, and my number 2 boy, my younger son, met me at the door, and I said, honey, go get Daddy the Framus. Well, my number 2 boy is not like my number 1 boy, and my number 1 boy is a very literal-minded character. He would have said, what's a Framus? But not my number 2 boy. He said, where is the Framus, Daddy? So I said, it's on the fortisite, where it always is. So he went off happily, went into the living room where his younger brother was reading a comic book, and he says, Daddy wants the Framus. And he says, it's on the fortisite. Where's the fortisite? Whereupon his older brother said, Daddy's just kidding me. Well, he came back and he said, you're just kidding me, aren't you? And I said, yes. Now, of course, the thing that this proved to me was this, that at least in my own family, there was evidence that at 3.5, the child was on to the patterns of the language. That is, although the kid obviously doesn't know at this age all of the vocabulary he's going to know when he's a fully functioning adult, and doesn't even know, obviously, the meaning of all the words he can use within the patterns. The point is, he does know the patterns, and this kid, in effect, knew that a Framus and a Forsythe, that they were both nouns, although he'd never hear that word for many, many years. He knew, so to speak, they were both nouns. He knew that a Framus had to refer to something as he had used the language in terms of interacting with other people in his culture, even at the age of 3.5. That Framus had to refer to something that a kid of 3.5 would be able to get for his dad. And he knew that a Forsythe had to be something that wasn't too high for a 3.5-year-old boy to reach on the top of and get the Framus and bring it to his father. In other words, the point is that the patterns of the language are very early and thoroughly inculcated into the human being if he's physiologically normal. Obviously, there is a difference in aptitude, but the most important thing is that, by and large, all physiologically normal kids are onto this at about the same time, we would seem to think. Now, any child can learn any number of languages at this time if people just simply keep using the same language to him consistently. If Mama and Daddy speak English, and the nurse speaks Chinese, and the kids he plays with speak Spanish, he'll learn all three of those languages and keep them all apart with no difficulty during this learning period. The child can learn many languages if he is presented with them in consistent experience and interaction situations, and any adult can learn any number of languages if he wants to. To sum up then, on our program today, what we've tried to do is to complete our definition, to show you that every language is just about as good, just about as bad, just about as inefficient, just about as precise, efficient, imprecise, and so on as any other language. There are no primitive languages. Every language is equally old. Languages are different because cultures are different. That's the important thing. And cultures are different because people have developed different answers to the universal problems of human existence. Well, next week, I want to go on with this language learning business. I want to find out, if I can, or explore a little further with you, how adults can learn languages more efficiently. I also want to talk about this whole business of correctness. In other words, is one usage correct? Is there only one way to talk, and all that, one correct way? Do languages die or change? Be with us then, will you?